characteristic, and then the characteristic attracts the, yeah. Okay, so then insurers, they want to hold down the coverage and lower the price of their products to drive away sick people, right? Because sick people most value having high amount of coverage, and we'll talk about that on the next slide if we have enough time. So colleges may also choose their facilities to attract the right type of people. So they might build a big arts area, even though they're not a traditional art school, because they want to start attracting more students to do arts there. Goldman Sachs is infamous, and sort of all investment banks are infamous for like making life absolute hell for people who work there, like during their first few years. And the question is, why would they do that? I mean, they actually certainly drive people past the point of negative marginal product, because people are like working till like 2 in the morning. If you just like let them get some sleep, they're going to be infinitely more productive than like screwing everything up at 2 in the morning. But I think the reason they do it is they don't want people who aren't like incredibly dedicated to investment banking in the firm. So they try to drive them away by driving them crazy. Right? So intellectual property is a useful way to reward innovations. This is my job market paper actually. Because intellectual property is most valuable to products that actually expect to have a large market for them. If you just gave out a prize, you might not attract the best products, right? Because the prize, is not more valuable to people who are expecting to be able to sell more. Intellectual property is, so it helps sort for the right types of products. And I'm working with Jean Tirole right now and thinking about how competition policy might be more harmful for the bad products. And that's the reason why you use competition policy to keep out of the market firms that are just copying. Yeah, Maria.
I just have a quick question on the distortion. Well, like referencing the equations you got for distortion, how would that be changed if you were talking about a market where like the company tries to like separate people into 2 separate categories? I don't know if Aaron was bringing this up with like Washington Post, but like for example, Hertz is trying to acquire Dollar Thrifty, and like those are 2 very different companies. You can argue that they're trying to like separate like the people who are looking for more luxury cars, nicer service.
That's a good question.
Is the distortion going to change?
It's going to be different. Yeah. I mean, it's going to be a bit different. You can use sort of similar approaches to think about it, because you can sort of think of the relative price that they do for like different levels of quality as being sort of like another instrument, and you can use the same sort of logic to think about it. The actual conclusions you're going to get out are going to be quite different. Industrial policy, similarly, is going to be valuable to the extent that you're able to target the firms that generate the most inframarginal surplus, and harmful to the extent that you don't manage that. So I want to give just one example, because this may or may not be relevant to a future problem set, about the Rothschild-Stiglitz model. So this is a model about insurance. Patients in this model differ only in their degree of health. This is the classic Rothschild-Stiglitz model. And they don't care, they're two insurers competing, and they don't care which insurer they get just as well, they just care about the level of coverage that the insurer has. And that's very Bertrand-like, right? Like, the 2 guys are exactly identical except in terms of their level of coverage and price. And the Rothschild-Stiglitz model leads to this crazy conclusion, which is that there's no equilibrium, because all the firms are always going to want to like lower their price and lower their level of coverage sort of infinitely, because then they can always steal all the healthy guys from the other one. And so basically there's no equilibrium. Because there's this extreme thing that if I lower my price a little bit and my coverage a little bit, I steal all the healthy people and drive away all the sick people to you. Right? And so this is like not very useful in practice, even though it seems like that sort of an effect might play some role in the real world. Because in the real world we do see equilibrium. We don't see like infinitely bad outcomes. So like how can you apply this? So in the real world, I think the reason that this doesn't apply so directly is that the things are differentiated. You may have a favorite insurer, you may have other reasons why you like one insurer over the other. It's not true that if one insurer is just a tiny bit better, I don't have time, I'm sorry, we should talk after class. Yeah, if one insurer is just a tiny bit better than the other, then everyone is going to leave to that, right? It's going to be a much more continuous process than that. So imagine we have 2 symmetrically differentiated insurers, 1 and 2. And they're symmetrically differentiated in the sense that the distribution of people who like one more than the other is the same. Everything's sort of symmetric in that sense. And they can choose their level of coverage and their price. And everyone has a cost of being covered, which is related to their type. But their type may also affect, which insurer they like better, how much they're willing to pay overall, et cetera, et cetera. Their utility as a function of the coverage level. And their cost of being covered doesn't depend on who covers them, it only depends on their type and the level of coverage offered. And then they're going to play a Nash-Bertrand equilibrium in price and coverage level. And because we're going to look for symmetric equilibrium, at that symmetric equilibrium, there's going to be some margin of people who switch between the two insurers, and some margin of people who exit the market for each of the firms. And those are going to be the same size for each of the firms because everything's symmetric. The social optimum is price equals marginal cost. That is, price is going to be equal to the average cost of covering someone who's on the market expansion, the exiting margin, right? Because that's like a marginal consumer for the market as a whole. Oh, Jesus. And the optimal level of coverage is going to be such that the average marginal utility minus the average marginal cost of providing the coverage is equal to some sorting term. But this is only along the market expansion margin. So the social planner does engage in some cream skimming, but only along people who are exiting the market. The symmetric equilibrium is going to have a bunch of distortions associated with it. So one distortion is just, there's market power. So there's going to be a Cournot distortion. A second distortion is that the firm is going to set price not equal to the average cost of serving someone who's exiting the market, but the average cost of someone who's either exiting or switching into the firm. Because the social planner doesn't care if someone switches firm and someone else has to cover them. They only care about if someone exits the market. Whereas this guy is going to care about not getting the people who are really unhealthy from his rival. And that is basically the same as Akerloff's adverse selection distortion. Then the optimal level of coverage is going to be distorted in two ways. Rather than taking into account the marginal value to the average insured person, you only take it into account for the marginal person. Right? That's the Spence distortion that we talked about. That's going to be the marginal person over both your exiting and switching margins. Then he's going to do the optimal sorting, but there's going to also be this Rothschild-Stiglitz cream skimming distortion, which is that if I lower my coverage, if I raise my coverage, if I lower my coverage and attract by that way the good people away from you, if I skim the cream, that doesn't matter from a social perspective, but from my private perspective, that's great. And it incurs an externality on you, and that's the reason why there's a cream skimming distortion. And this is divided by the market power I have on the switching margin. As we get towards perfect competition, as we get towards Bertrand, that market power goes away. This becomes zero. So this whole thing becomes infinity. And that's the reason why the Rothschild-Stiglitz model goes to hell when it's perfectly undifferentiated. Now the interesting thing about this is competition makes this better, it reduces market power. It makes this worse because the more people are switching between us, the more I'm trying to steal the good people from you, the more adverse selection there is. It makes the Spence distortion better because the switching people are closer to the average, and it makes the Rothschild-Stiglitz distortion much worse. So competition has all these different, potentially offsetting effects on what happens. And I'm way over, so thank you guys.